Thanks for coming back for the second part of this discussion of using the critical power model to help understand training and racing. Now that we've laid a foundation of understanding of how this relates to training intensity and zones and why it's very challenging to improve the anaerobic work capacity by training up here, I want to talk about, I believe, probably the most misunderstood and misapplied training method. And often I think people feel like I don't understand or don't believe in or whatever high intensity training. No, I've trained people whose events are 3.5, 4 minutes long. I understand how to use high intensity training. And there is a time and a place for it for pretty much everybody. But I think it's also very misunderstood and misapplied by most folks who, especially self-coached and amateurs, and even many professional coaches, frankly. And I want to talk about some of that today and why I think it gets misused. But I'm going to base it on this understanding that we hopefully developed in the first video that you've already watched, I hope. And if you haven't, you should go back and see that. But the thing that I see happening is, there's tons and tons of scientific studies that come out in journals talking about the efficacy of high intensity training for increasing primarily VO2 max. And those studies, it's interesting to me that often those studies are there. I think some of the problems with those studies is, number one, they often use not particularly well-trained, either active or not very active folks, where almost any training you do is going to improve that quality. But also but even if they're using moderately well-trained or even well-trained athletes, the studies are quite short. They're just a few weeks long usually. And often they'll see pretty significant changes in the qualities they're looking for, which primarily in those types of tests are looking to see how much improvement do we get in VO2 max, because VO2 max can be and is a marker for endurance performance. Although, as I've talked about many times before, of the three primary best predictors of endurance performance, VO2 max is probably the worst, the best being your speed at this critical power or this threshold that we've talked about, the second threshold. And then the other one that's actually better than VO2 max as a predictor is economy. What is it costing you energy-wise to run at this intensity right here? Now, that doesn't mean, again, that VO2 max is a worthless thing. Obviously, the person with the biggest VO2 max has the potential to elevate this critical power threshold higher and higher and higher, because their absolute peak power is higher than people with lower ones. So, I'm not debunking that at all. I'm not critiquing that at all. However, what I think gets misunderstood and misapplied is, in these studies, often they put people through these protocols that frankly sound really brutal to me. We did, in every week we did like 18 workouts of this intensity. Not really, I'm exaggerating there, but often see, we did 4 days of, these VO2 max type very high intensity workouts. And we did, the other days were relegated to training around this threshold. A lot of hard work, which of course, doing a lot of hard work should show some benefits, but who trains like that? I mean, you would not be able to handle a very high training volume like that. And one of the things we do know from looking at successful endurance athletes training their blocks, or excuse me, how they balance intensities, is that successful endurance athletes across a broad spectrum of sports train roughly 80 to 90% of their training below this threshold and only 10% above that threshold. Well, the studies kind of flip that on their head and sometimes don't even have any low intensity or moderate intensity training. So they're just doing nothing but high intensity training. The problem I have with that in real life, and this is where I think how people get messed up with this, is that if you did that for very many weeks, you'd be a wreck. And in the process, and I'm going to explain why, you will have damaged your aerobic base. And the aerobic base serves a vital function in endurance performance. And so we don't see athletes training the way these people are conducting these studies. And yet the studies are often interpreting or lead people to believe that this is the way you should train to improve endurance performance because we improve this important marker VO2 max by this much percentage in doing, this type of training. I mean, the risk of injury, the risk of overtraining, and the potential damage to the aerobic base over a long duration. If you can continue that type of training for a long time, it's well understood. And again, we don't see successful endurance athletes training that way. So I struggle to understand why these people that are studying these, I mean, I guess I understand it because when you're doing a study, you need to isolate a particular thing you're trying to study. Well, they're trying to study the effects of this high intensity training, so they do the high intensity training. But we as coaches and you as athletes don't train that way. We have to look at the whole package. We have to look at, months and months and months and years of development. So we can't just isolate that one factor and suddenly put it on a pedestal as the be all and end all of endurance training. So what I want to speak about, I've already talked about how this critical power, the second threshold, is one of the most trainable qualities that we as humans have in terms of being able to elevate this threshold in terms of its speed or power, however you want to measure it. But I think we'll use speed because I think that's the easiest to wrap our heads around. And but this stuff below that critical, or actually even below this blue line, that is what historically has been called the aerobic base. And so this aerobic base, yes, it may not be the specific intensity that you're going to race a vertical kilometer at, or your skimo races, or even a half marathon. No, it's not. Although it is quite specific to multi-hour events. This is pretty close to the intensity of a marathon and beyond. So this is actually the specific intensity that the event will be competed at. But in shorter events, they'll be competed much closer up to this red line, that critical power line. But this stuff down below here, this intensity zone down here, zones 1 and 2, they provide a base of support for everything that gets layered on top of that. And if the base is weak, then the stuff that goes on top of it is not going to be as effective. This is why when we look at historical data, we look at training logs of successful athletes. And Steven Seiler did a study on this around the turn of the century, around 2000, where he looked at some of the best, some world champion athletes in the sports of cross-country skiing, running, cycling, I believe rowing, and maybe even swimming. And what he found was that they did about 90% of their training below this second threshold. 90% of the training volume. Don't get this confused with the 80-20 idea, where it was when he first published that study, it came out with 80% of their workouts were done in this intensity zone, and 20% of the workouts were done up in the higher intensity zones 4 to 5. But that's the number of workouts. Well, obviously, a 3-hour long easy run, it should be weighted time-wise much more heavily than a 45-minute interval session. So later we went back and said, hey, we're going to recalculate this based on not the number of the workouts, but the actual time spent in these intensity zones. And it turned out to be 90-10, not 80-20. So why would all these great athletes be training that way if what really mattered was all this training up here? Well, it's because this training up here has an incredibly powerful training effect, but as I've said many times before, it comes at the expense of a huge amount of global fatigue and a potential reduction in the training volume of this stuff down here. And if you reduce the training volume of the aerobic base, it begins to go away. So if the balance of training gets heavily weighted towards high intensity, zone 4 and 5, as compared to this, and we often see people who get swept up in the idea that if a little high intensity is good, more is going to be better. And so maybe they get into a situation where they're doing 50-50 in terms of time, or even more. I've seen people going the 80-20 direction the other way, where they're doing a huge amount of this high intensity. And that's kind of what some of these studies look like. Well, over time, when you over emphasize the training in this above this threshold and underemphasize the training here, the aerobic base shrinks because it's not being stimulated enough. And the stuff above here gets most of the stimulation. These fast twitch B fibers and the fast twitch A fibers get a lot of stimulation there. So what I see so often is that people will see a study or they will see some kind of thing on social media that looks like a very fancy or very strenuous interval session that someone's doing, and they think, oh, that must be the key to what the success for this athlete. But no, it's all this stuff that's kind of hidden below. It's all this stuff that makes up the base that really allows those people to benefit from a tiny, tiny fraction. And I'll give you an example. So until this last Olympics, when we saw Johannes Klebo dominate the men's field and win 6 gold medals in cross-country skiing, the most successful cross-country skier ever had been a Norwegian woman named Marit Bjørgen. And after she retired, she and her coaches released, they did basically a study, and it was released in a number of or a peer-reviewed journal. And they exposed here's her training. Here's what her training looked like over the course of her career. And this is a woman who won more medals than anybody who had ever won. I think she might still have the medal record overall in cross-country skiing from Olympics and World Championships. But she raced in everything from a 3.5-minute sprint to a 2.5-hour 50-kilometer races and was dominant during her career at all of those. And even though she was training for this 3.5-minute event, still 90% of her training was done down here and only 10% up in here over the course of it was at least a 10-year career that she had of this success. So again, if this intense focus on high intensity was really that successful, why is it that we don't see it in the elite athletes? And so I want people to pay attention to that when a new study comes out that shows, oh, this type of interval protocol produced a 22% increase in VO2 max over 6 weeks, blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, it's really interesting and it's great, but that's not the only thing that goes into endurance performance, first of all. And secondly, think about the fact, okay, that was 6 weeks. Well, what if you did that for 6 months? What would happen to you? How would your body respond to that? And at the expense of what? If you did that, a lot of that type of training. So, you could end up, when I've seen this happen, people who do an excessive amount of high intensity training will lower, especially this aerobic threshold. Not so much the second threshold, because people who do a lot of high intensity are kind of bouncing above and below this critical power threshold. But the aerobic threshold will decline, which is really where the aerobic base comes from. And why is the aerobic base so important? Well, there's a lot of speculation as to why that is. There's the duration component that, your body just needs to get used to being moving for hours and hours at a time, and especially in the ultra long distance events. But something I've pointed out in both the books that I've written, Training for the Uphill Athlete and Training for the New Alpinism, something we learned in 1982 when a researcher, George Brooks, discovered the mechanism for what's called the lactate shuttle. Many people have heard that term now, although they might not quite understand it. But there are 2 really critical proteins, the MCT1 transporter and then the MCT4. One of them moves the lactate out of muscle cells into the bloodstream, and the other moves it from the bloodstream into some other muscle cells. So, and you might recall, if you've read my book and you've seen the physiology chapter, I have a cute little diagram of a vacuum cleaner. Well, if the lactate's being produced mostly, and remember, lactate's not the cause of fatigue, it's just a marker for fatigue. There are a lot of other things that can potentially cause fatigue, but lactate has the advantage of having a lot of energy. It's still a form of sugar in a way, so it can enter into the mitochondria and be used as fuel very effectively. In fact, George Brooks tells us it's the preferred fuel for these slow twitch muscle fibers over glucose. that lactate is actually preferred. He's done research more recently on that. But anyway, so if these at around this threshold, above it and a little below it, where these two fibers, the fast twitch A and the fast twitch B, they're burning a lot of glucose to produce the power they need to run that fast. So they're producing a lot of lactate. Well, we know that with the accumulation of lactate comes a negative feedback that basically tells these fibers, hey, you can't be producing this. You can't be producing that power any much more. So you're going to they kind of down-regulate glycolysis when lactate goes up. Again, it's not necessarily the cause of this happening, but it is a marker for it happening. But we know that when that lactate levels are low, the endurance can be continued, that the intensity can be continued for longer times. Well, what Brooks found out, because the slow twitch fibers have a preference for lactate as a fuel, even over glucose, and it's being produced in these fast twitch fibers, which in some cases are adjacent to, right next to the slow twitch fibers, that the slow twitch fibers, because of these two transporters, MCT1 and MCT4, they will transport the lactate into the slow twitch fibers, where instead of accumulating, it actually gets to do some positive work. It gets used as a fuel. And that's where I have the little vacuum cleaner picture, basically with the slow twitch fibers acting as a vacuum cleaner to take up the lactate that's being produced here and do something constructive or useful with it, producing energy. The vacuum cleaner that is these slow twitch fibers, that is the aerobic base. That is because, remember, this is where those slow twitch fibers are really active, is in this low intensity. The bigger that vacuum cleaner, or the bigger the aerobic base, the more of this lactate that they can take up, which means the more time that these fast twitch fibers can stay in the game, producing the power you need to run at speeds at this critical threshold and even above that, they can do that longer if there's a place for that lactate to go. And that place that lactate goes is into the slow twitch fibers, which make up the aerobic base. So the reason for doing all this low intensity training, and why I say that everything from here on stacks on top of the base, that is that the bigger this base, the stronger the vacuum cleaner, the more lactate it can take up, the more high intensity you can sustain over a longer duration. So that's why these really successful athletes, in the study by Seiler, there's been several studies by Seiler on this, the study on Bjorgen's training history, and there's many others, have demonstrated that the best endurance athletes in the world do a phenomenal amount of low intensity volume. I mean, you look at the training that's done by, a world-class marathoner. They're running, in some cases up to 200 miles a week. And you can't run 200 miles a week up in this intensity zone, of course. So they're doing most of that training. The bulk, or probably 90+% of that training, is being done down here to develop or enhance the capacity of that vacuum cleaner, the slow twitch. So again, what I'm trying to emphasize here is people get too carried away with, number one, the efficacy, which can be exciting to see the efficacy of high intensity training in an athlete, but it also tends to lead people down this more is better path. And I've seen more overtrained athletes because of too much high intensity training than anything else. Yes, you can overtrain yourself with too much low intensity, but I see more injury and more overtraining over the course of a 30-year coaching career of people that overdo this high intensity stuff up here. So I hope that's helpful. And when I have some other ideas, I'll come back for the next video.